And also General Wesley Clark, the military head of NATO, was a Rhodes Scholar. And so Solana is part of this plan. He goes over there and, as I said, reads Olmert, the Riot Act, you're dependent, Israel, on investment and, foreign loans and so forth, and you better back off. We want peace and all that stuff. And so Olmert backs off, and so the carrot and the stick, and they're pressuring them into this, wearing them down. You remember Mazzini and Pike, all these religious people wear each other down, and they get tired, and then they'll come to us for their sovereigns and pontiffs, and they'll agree, to this Middle East union that we're going to have under their dominance. The problem is, what will happen is strong Israelis, let's say Orthodox Israelis, they won't, have their doors knocked into the synagogues and dragged out or anything, but what will happen is through a Delphi technique, they'll be portrayed as extremists, you must compromise for the greater good, and so on. And that's why more liberal elements in Israel are willing to go along with this. So like Samuel back in the 1920s, a liberal Jew was pardoning, what's his name, even though he had killed many Jews. So there's really among the neocons factions here. You have like the PNAC Crystal faction, and then you have these other groups. I think Rumsfeld and Cheney are looking at this larger globalist notion in the same way Kissinger, who was a Rockefeller student, and Brzezinski are looking at it, the grand chessboard, the manipulation of Muslims and others for Caspian oil and for power and control to bring about these regional arrangements. And they actually started these like Hezbollah, for example. But what happened was in my second part of what is the role of Iran, we knew in the 80s about the Islamic Jihad organization. And we knew that they had declared, in effect, a secret war against the U.S. And the way I'm getting that is a Middle East operative, Robert Baer, a CIA agent. He had a book, See No Evil. And he was there for many, many years. And he said there was an intelligence report back in March of 82, 13 months before the embassy bombing over there, saying that there was this network which could destroy the embassy in Beirut. And it was conducted by the Islamic Jihad, which is, he said, merely a front for the Iranians. This is where Iran gets into it. And so what happened was Iran was basically declaring a war on us during the Reagan years. You also have somebody, Yosef Bodansky, who is director of the U.S. House of Representatives Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. And he was looking back, now this is looking back into the 80s, and he had identified there was this Islamic infrastructure. They were in the U.S., they had safe houses and weapons and all this stuff. And Bodansky said they had actually had training suicide pilots at Bushehr Air Base in Iran in the early 80s, is first established at Waqilabad near Mashhad. And what he said was he talked to one of these trainees later, and he said one of the exercises included having an Islamic Jihad detachment seize an aircraft, to transport aircraft, and what they would do is crash that airliner with its passengers into a selected object, like 9/11 and so on. And so what you see is that the only way we could know stuff like that is back in the 80s if we were already monitoring them. The National Security Agency, CIA, was already watching. I mean, how else would you know they had money and weapons and safe houses and false identity papers and so on, unless you were already monitoring these people. And the same thing goes on, for example, with Oklahoma City. In Oklahoma City, you had reports there, and Bodansky mentioned this, that what they were doing was getting some lily whites, they called them, in the U.S. They were training them, trained by Iran, and the training was conducted by one of their groups, their subgroups, Hamas. And the training occurred in 1993, and they used code names that were given car bomb training, like that blew up the Murrah office building. And at least two of these people trained in 93 came from Oklahoma City. And what you find out then, Bodansky wrote a book called Bin Laden, 1999. And I'll just read this real quick. He said, in the early months of 1996, Tehran, that's Iran, started laying the foundation for the next phase in the terrorist jihad, establishment of the Hezbollah International. All right, so there they are, establishing them, 1996, with Osama bin Laden in a senior position. See, there's the relationship between Osama and Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. And Bodansky goes on, says, the significance of this organization for the prevailing terrorist threat was demonstrated in its first strikes. Now, I'm going to read you the first strikes. Now, remember, this is Bodansky, head of the U.S. House Terrorist Investigation Subcommittee, all right? He's the investigator. This isn't some right-wing wacko somewhere. He says their first strikes, Hezbollah, first strikes trained, an Iranian subgroup, Hezbollah. First strikes were the bombing of the U.S. barracks in Khobar, Saudi Arabia, the downing of TWA 800. See that? The U.S. government doesn't say anything about that, but here he is acknowledging it, the downing of TWA 800 and the assassination of a U.S. intelligence officer in Cairo. So right here, it's very, very clear that this was a creation by Iran, and what it was used for, whether it's Oklahoma City, whether it's downing TWA 800, and the only way we could know all this stuff is if we were monitoring these people way back in the 80s. And so, like I said, there's two different elements. There's one element that has this larger globalist plan among the neocons, and then there's a different element, I would say the PNAC majority, the majority of the PNAC, Project for New American Century, William Crystal, and they're different. They have a different perspective.
So where do you think we are going to move? Why all the drum noises about Iran right now?
Well, because of the sort of handwriting on the wall. What you would have is this projection, this prophecy by this particular sect that I mentioned that thinks this all may come about within a couple of years. And so they want to speed this process along. There's a timetable. The mullahs are there. They are saying on Frontline, they were asking some of these people, the Iranians, what would happen? And they say, well, we're not going to reveal what we would do, but the plan, I think, is multifold. What they will do is the first thing that they will do is they will strike, they call the Abqaiq facility in Saudi Arabia. Why? What did Saudis do to them? Well, they're an ally of the U.S. They've allowed these infidels on holy ground, and they don't like them. And Osama bin Laden doesn't like the royal family, and they've appealed, they're oppressing the poor Arabs. They're making deals with the evil U.S. and so on. But secondly, they'll also try and hit Israel. There's a particular, they'll strike the Dimona, D-I-M-O-N-A, in response to a U.S. attack. The quote is from Herat's correspondent, Yossi Melman. He says, this is his report, quote, if the U.S. launches an attack on Iran, the Islamic Republic will retaliate with a military strike on Israel's main nuclear facility. Dr. Abbasi, an advisor to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, said Tehran would respond to an American attack with strikes on the Dimona nuclear reactor and other strategic strikes at the port city of Haifa and so forth and so on. Now, they may try that. I got a feeling the Israelis, since they had great success with Syria and wipe that out. However, I don't know to what extent they won't be able to actually hit the Abqaiq facility in Saudi Arabia. And that would, our vulnerability in the West, the U.S., especially economic. I mean, they're not going to, defeat us militarily, but they can cause some real problems, especially since they've been having a lot of meetings with Hugo Chavez. And recently, Putin says attack against Iran is, quote, unacceptable, and China gets a lot of its oil from Iran, and so they could, play games over there in the Far East with Taiwan or whatever. So my guess is what they would do is they may try, as a sort of to occupy Israel, some sort of suicide assault over there. The Israelis will knock them out, but there would be maybe some success in hitting some Saudi locations that would affect oil flow. They may even have success in blocking the exit of the Gulf there to the oil tankers, the Strait of Hormuz. They may be able to do something like that. They also take notice of what's happening in this country, the winds, the Santa Ana winds, and how it spreads fire. They may have their operatives in the U.S. already to do nasty things with fire, not only forests, but with houses in Topeka, all over the place, derailing trains, messing with food supplies and so forth, just to create a sort of panic in this country. I mean, it doesn't take much, all you have to have is one operative on a motor scooter at night, setting fires around neighborhoods and so forth to occupy any town's fire departments and so on. But anyway, my guess is they'll have a multi-phase attack. And also, I really don't see Condoleezza Rice as going as she did over there to a meeting recently and saying, if you sort of slow down or back off on this nuclear program, we will be willing to engage in a multifaceted range of discussions on issues of importance. I mean, that would be perceived by the Iranians, especially the mullahs who run the country, as a sign of weakness. They take that as weakness. Now, why would we do that? I think the only reason we didn't do anything yet is because of the Russian, Putin, and the Chinese pressure. I think that they could make things difficult. Not so much Iran.